Greetings and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Eric Parkinson. I'm president and publisher of Hanover House. 40 years ago, America's innocence was shattered by 4 gunshots in Dallas and the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. While the nation grieved, a transition of power occurred that had been in the works for over 2 years. Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson succeeded JFK to the position of president, and the course of history was forever changed. The subsequent investigation into the assassination resulted in the infamous Warren Commission report and the lone gunman theory that most Americans believe to be so absurd that over 80% believe that a much larger plan was involved. That has since been proven true. New evidence has been released that clearly shows the direct involvement of LBJ and his advisors in the assassination and subsequent cover-up. An insider to the LBJ team has released some of this evidence in a new book, but more proof of what really happened in 1963 is still being withheld and should be released for public review and discussion. In the words of John Fitzgerald Kennedy himself, the great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. After 40 years, the American public has tired of the myth of the Warren Commission report and demands to know the truth. It is my pleasure to introduce a brave man who knows the truth as a true insider to the LBJ team. His knowledge and insight will serve as a springboard to re-examine the JFK assassination case and the requests that are being made to the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Department of Justice, and the National Archives to release sealed documents that are relevant in this matter. Some of the evidence is presented in the book, Blood, Money, and Power: How LBJ Killed JFK. To discuss his book and the new evidence and today's call for action, I'm very proud to bring you author and attorney Barr McClellan.
Thank you, Eric, and ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. We are here because of the book I wrote, Blood, Money, and Power: How LBJ Killed JFK. I was fortunate to be helped by about 20 very qualified researchers, but the book is my responsibility, and I accept that, of course. The book is like many books. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, a cover, but it's different. Authors are instructed by many other writers to write from their experience, and of course I could write this book from my experience. But there's more to it. It deals with the real world, with what's going on even today, and so it's not a book of deep history, of something that happened a long time ago. It's a book of things going on right now. And it's a book about the assassination of John Kennedy, which is one of the most emotional issues I think that the American people have to struggle with. Because of that, there's been a lot of books written, a lot of things said, and I have tried in my book to avoid as much as possible anything I might tell you. What I've tried to do is focus on what I call the hard evidence. In fact, in the book, you could take out the hard evidence, the exhibits themselves with the explanations of what each one represents, and have the heart of the story. We have today placed some of these key exhibits on the wall. Now, there are a total of 68 exhibits, but the first one is the mastermind behind the assassination. That man is Edward Clark, and he is at the top left. Ed Clark was recognized as early as 1949 as the boss of Texas. He had a system for cutting deals with judges and legislators where they would agree with him and do what he said, and he was very effective about it. It's what came to be known as Bubba Justice, and he was good. And he was the man that was called on by Johnson. But let me turn you to the next exhibit, which is his war record. A lot of people don't know about these things, and they wouldn't be public knowledge except for the fact that he left all of his personal records to one of his universities, and they weren't vacuumed. Typically, these personal records are very carefully gone through by lawyers, and what just might be bad is thrown out. Well, we found several in there, and the librarian at first didn't want to release them, but they did. And the second document up there beside him is his Army record. At a time when the war was going very badly for the United States, we were barely holding on in Guadalcanal, and we just landed in North Africa. He was stealing money from the quartermaster in Florida. He was kicked out of the Army with about as summary a kick out as you can do. They even brought his wife in to make sure that there was never a claim for any benefits for being a veteran. This was never known. This, of course, was kept quiet, but it's a measure of the man and the capability of what he could do, and he did. The next picture, the next exhibit up there, the handwritten note, is written by Edward Clark, and this was written shortly after the famous or infamous 1948 stolen election, when Lyndon Johnson, with one of my law partners named Don Thomas, down there stuffing the ballot box, getting 202 extra votes, mostly dead people. Shortly after that, financial problems arose, and the letter, handwritten by Edward Clark, is to the effect that we have to take care of this man for good, and we have financial problems, and we have to make some special arrangements calling the notes, and it's a dangerous thing to do, in effect. The next letter is the typewritten letter back on the top right there. That's from Lyndon Johnson the next day, saying, I know the risk you're taking, and we appreciate what you're doing, and we will see that you are protected. In effect, at an early time here, they've laid out a conspiracy. These are the basic elements of a conspiracy to control things, cover up things, to commit crimes. The next picture, the next photo on the second row on the left there, is a letter from Lyndon Johnson in 1960 in which he expresses his great esteem for Edward Clark. He says he knows there's no man to whom he's more indebted, and he knows that everything's been possible through what Edward Clark has been able to do. What we have here is an acknowledgement in 1960 of the power Clark had over Johnson during these years. There's something else about it. Clark operated back in Texas, and the national media didn't pick up a lot of this information. And the Texas media was about the good old boys, just like the Democratic Party was back in those days. So this type of information was just not generally known, and that's what I'm bringing out here. The next is a composite, and this was made in 1961, shortly after our 1960 letter here. The composite was of a man who was involved somehow, they weren't sure at the time when they made the composite, in the murder of a Department of Agriculture official who was investigating some schemes that Johnson had been involved in. The composite was released, and I've put up there next to it a picture of Mac Wallace. And Mac Wallace is the key hitman we've been able to identify. Mac Wallace was involved with Johnson from early on. He went to school in Austin, Texas. In 1951, he killed a man to help a scandal from being made public. He killed this man, Doug Kinzer, who was involved in a sex circle with Lyndon Johnson's sister, Josepha. And Kinzer had been wanting some money from the federal government. At the time, this was right after the '48 election, and everybody in the state was getting ready to run against Lyndon Johnson. He could not take any scandal, and it was brewing in a very bad way. Doug Kinzer was killed. To keep it quiet, Mac Wallace was the man who did the job. When he was arrested, he admitted he was working for Johnson, and nothing else was ever heard of it. He was tried, convicted, the jury split. They wanted to give him the death penalty or a life sentence. He was being tried by one of Edward Clark's lawyers. The lawyer took the case, gave him a 5-year sentence, and suspended it. Wallace walked away a free man. Then Wallace appears again, and there's his picture, and you can compare it to the composite. And my point is, these exhibits speak for themselves. Those two men, I mean, the composite and the man are one and the same. What really brings it home is the next document up, which is the one on the middle right there. That's an indictment by a grand jury in Texas, and it was an indictment action for the murder of Henry Marshall, who was shot by Mac Wallace on June 3 of 1961. The indictment, however, was not returned until 1984. And the indictment itself reads that 3 persons responsible are now deceased, which means they couldn't indict them. But they were named as Mac Wallace, Cliff Carter, and Lyndon Johnson. So you have a picture here in 1961 of what is going to motivate Johnson to do what he does. The next picture, the bottom left one, is of D.H. Byrd, and he was a member of Big Oil up in Dallas. Big oil plays a big role in this. They were key supporters of Johnson. Johnson, during his Senate years, was literally the lobbyist for the oil industry on the floor of the Senate. And D.H. Byrd is the man who owned the Texas School Book Depository. So we're bringing all of this down to these final two pictures, the middle two pictures. The second one from the left is a photo of the Warren Commission, taken by the Warren Commission, of the fingerprints that were recovered by the Warren Commission at the Sniper's Nest on the 6th floor of the depository. When I started my research to finish the book up, I went to the Warren Commission records. I knew Johnson was involved. I had to see what proof I could put together. And there were a bunch of fingerprints that were recovered by the Warren Commission that were not identified. I knew Mac Wallace had had a print card from his murder in 1951, and we got those two together. The archives provided the fingerprints that were recovered from the picture there, the Sniper's Nest, and we had the print card. We took them as a blind submission to a highly qualified latent print examiner in Austin, Texas, name of Nathan Darby. And Nathan helped Kodak develop a fingerprint system, and he set up the fingerprint identification system for the Philippines. He agreed to take it blind. We did that because people get so emotional about the assassination and either have a fixed opinion or just can't really look at something objectively, that we did it that way, and he agreed, and he found the match. At that point, we knew we had the case we needed. I've been building up to, with these exhibits, to what else was going on, and there are more. But we had the heart of the case, and it's not what I can tell you, it's what these exhibits say. And that put the lid on the case. And I was able to go with the book, speak with Eric, and we've had a good relationship ever since, I have to add. But the book could be finished, but there was another step that you need to see, and that's the last exhibit. It comes back to Edward Clark, where the cover-up becomes a part of the crime. This letter was written by Leon Jaworski to the attorney for Jack Ruby, who happened to be a very dear friend of Edward Clark's, where they're telling Tannehill, don't get Ruby excited, keep him quiet, in effect, muzzle him. So the cover-up becomes complete, the crime becomes complete. I've been able to lay out through these hard exhibits, which again is not anything I have to tell you, these are all public records. This is how it happened and how it falls together. Now, that's just, like I say, a good part of the book, of all the exhibits. The story itself to really be told, the facts to be brought out, to avoid theory and to deal with hard exhibits. I have to go back deep into Texas history, and we do that, to show how in early Texas history, at a time when Johnson and Clark were growing up, lynchings were common, people carried pistols all the time, and they were involved in these things. Then to get to their childhood, their growing up years, you can see how that violence remained a part of their lives. Johnson, had he been a juvenile today, would be a delinquent under today's standards. Probably the most brutal things he did, and this is well known, was killed a mule. It sounds like a simple thing, but back in those days, and even today, you don't go around killing domesticated animals, and he was mean. He stayed, the book then goes into how these men came together in Austin, how they became best of friends because Johnson's first election depended on Edward Clark going to the governor and getting the governor to enlist the state employees to vote for vote for Lyndon Johnson. The point there was Lyndon didn't even get a majority then. He barely had 30%, and it was a plurality type election. But their relationship started then and continued all through Johnson's career. The next part of the book turns on the real beginning of the conspiracy, and the conspiracy really begins with the 1948 election when Don Thomas, who was Lyndon Johnson's business attorney and one of the two men he worked most closely with the law firm, went down to Alice, Texas and stuffed the ballot box. I've mentioned that, but that was, again, a part of getting this relationship as solid as it was. So And of course, Clark plays another important role in that particular election when the state Democratic Committee approves the candidates. Johnson wins by 1 vote, and that 1 vote was Edward Clark. So the conspiracy can really be traced to these early years, and you can see how these men still had this willingness to do anything, that crime was okay. The law really meant nothing. And as I mentioned, Clark had such a control on the judges. His deal was very simple with them. If it's a close case, you rule for me. I get to call it a close case. If I call for you, you talk to me. And he made sure they stayed happy by giving them gifts, poker winnings, money to family, money to friends. He had them wrapped. Why it was so important for all of Texas is this was in Austin. And at the time, most of your state laws were enforced only in Travis County. So Clark had a real stranglehold on the state that way to make his Texas justice, Bubba justice work, and he did. What I've also been able to bring in is what else started about this time, and that's the money machine. Johnson was getting ready to run for re-election, and he had to be so good that no one would run against him, and he was successful, and he raised so much money that they had to run it through Brazos 10th Street Corporation. Now this begins the money trail, which I don't think has ever been covered in any other review regarding the assassination. He brings in so much money that they can use it to buy back his ranch, put money in banks, buy land. In other words, he got very wealthy through the Texas election and political process. This brings us down to the conspiracy itself, and one thing the Warren Commission really overlooked was motivation. I think any criminal investigator will tell you one of the first things you do is look at who stood to gain. They almost refused to look at that. When they were formed up, 2 of the men came in, 2 members of the commission came in and said, first of all, lone nuts do it all the time. That cut off conspiracy thinking. The second thing was, we're not a banana republic. I bring out in the book how we were a banana republic because Lyndon Johnson learned how to be one through George Parr down in the Texas Valley. We have then this motivation, and I've laid some of this out so far, but the big motivations Johnson had were twofold. When he was running the Senate, by 1960, he was recognized as the de facto president of the United States. And yet he has to step aside and let this young upstart named John Kennedy, who did not do any work in the Senate, become president. The flip side was the murder of Henry Marshall happened. During Kennedy's inaugural week, Johnson met with Billy Saul Estes, who was a promoter in agriculture back in Texas, and they knew they had to hush Henry Marshall. They wanted to talk to him and see if they could persuade him, and they sent Mac Wallace in to do the job. He went to see him at his ranch, Marshall's Ranch, on June 3 of 1961. They couldn't do anything. The fight ensued. He's knocked out. Wallace first tries to kill him with carbon monoxide poisoning, then shoots him 5 times with a bolt-action rifle. The next day, under, again, the Clark justice system, the JP rules a suicide. Well, no one really bought that. And this is when Johnson's troubles really started. So not only did he have this unlimited ambition to be president, to get all the power he could, he had this real fear of going to the jailhouse. The way he had put it, when he was de facto president, he was in the mansion. When he became vice president, he became the outhouse. And I add to it that he was really afraid of being in the jailhouse. So you put this man together, and you see everything is there. All the ingredients are there for him to make a decision that he's got to move up or he's got to move out. And if he moves out, he's indicted. So what happens is, and we see this from documents that he gave Ed Clark, is he provided Ed Clark the policy manual, the Secret Service policy manual for the protection of the president, while he was vice president, in effect laying out the game plan for how to conduct the assassination itself. Clark took on the job, and he took his time. It's not an easy thing to gather everything together that he needed to gather together. What he did do was make sure that some people would take care of his fees, in effect. He wanted to be paid, and he went to Murchison in Dallas to get a commitment there. I found out about this through work I was doing with another key member of Big Oil in Dallas, representing them in getting higher natural gas prices. We brought a case that ended up blowing the lid off gas regulation. And in the course of it, I learned how Murchison had been approached by Clark, and Murchison agrees to support Clark. He continues to support him during the presidency and after the presidency. But this puts all the ingredients into place, with Mac Wallace being called upon again, once again, to do the job. And we know how he operated. There was a witness who came forward. Lloyd Factor was his name, and a book came out on him. At the same time, I was completing my fingerprint research. This was all independent research, but Lloyd Factor is brought in by Mac Wallace. He's recruited at Sam Rayburn's funeral, and he is later tested to see if he can shoot, and he states that he was there at Dealey Plaza with Mac Wallace on the day of the assassination. We also know how Oswald came into the picture. He had come back from Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, and had been introduced to Russian expatriates in Dallas. Two of those people are good friends of Clark and let him know about this outsider, this unhappy person who was willing to do anything. I also learned about him through Sam Ballin, who was a client of mine, and he was an oil geologist who met Lee Harvey Oswald and tried to get him a job. And Sam confirmed to me later that the connections were there, that Lee Harvey Oswald was brought into the picture that way. We have more. Just like Lloyd Factor was tested by Wallace, Oswald was tested by seeing if he could shoot Edwin Walker, a general who had been retired for being critical of John Kennedy or of the Democratic policies at the time. And he was there helping Oswald carry off the shot. After the assassination, we know that Oswald was there from the rifles testing that was done by the Dallas Police Department. And this came out through the court of inquiry. So all the stage is set now for the assassination itself, and the crime scene analysis that we were able to do, and I say we, these researchers I was working with, really puts it all together. There were 4 people involved. Oswald shot, and he was a patsy. Wallace was there, and he got 1 shot in. We had a missed shot, and we had a guy over on the grassy knoll area in the stockade. There's a stockade fence there going to the triple underpass, and he fired the fatal shot. We've reconstructed this from the crime scene, and we know 2 very important things. One is, how did Wallace get away? And it became apparent he got away by taking the same route Oswald did, only he moved quicker and faster. He knew he had to get out under cover of the shock, and he did. There was another man with him who helped him and made sure the stairwell was open. We know they were there because there were 2 men stopped by the Dallas Police Department immediately after the shooting. And he said, they told me they were Secret Service agents, and the badges that anyone who claimed to be a Secret Service agent could only have come through the vice president. Similarly, a Dallas police officer stopped a man over by the pergola there on the grassy knoll area in the parking lot. He too said he was Secret Service. And this was the shooter, and we haven't been able to identify him yet. We've named him Junior for now. We don't have the kind of proof we have with Mac Wallace of eyewitnesses and confessions and fingerprints. The Warren Commission knew those 3 men had been spotted by the Dallas Police Department, and the Warren Commission said there were no Secret Service agents on the ground at the time. They didn't do anything else about it, seemingly by saying there were no Secret Service agents there. The men who told the Dallas Police Department they were Secret Service agents weren't there. But we know they were there. It was one other aspect of the Warren Commission study that was not looked into. So we have a complete picture of how the crime was conducted from a crime scene investigation itself. The shooting occurred, and the next step was what I've put in the title called Run. And that title starts immediately, that chapter starts immediately after the shooting with the men on the run, and it continues until the cover-up is complete, until we get to that last exhibit over there where Ruby is told to keep it quiet. I haven't completed all the work bringing Ruby into it. We've had some recent news that he may have been communicating with Johnson as early as 1962, before the assassination. But mainly we know that he had been recruited through Murchison and organized crime through what was known as the Red Man's Club in Dallas. Other researchers have come up this close. We've got Ruby into the picture. He had to be brought in because Oswald was supposed to die in a blaze of glory. And if you follow the Warren report, you'll see how that did happen. He didn't have his pistol, but he went to the boarding house, got it. First police officer he saw, he shot him. It was Officer Tippett. And when he gets to the Texas Theater to try and hide, he tries to shoot it out, and the Dallas Police Department, one officer was able to put his hand on the gun before it could be fired. So we got a problem. Oswald is still around. The cover-up is not. The cover-up is in danger. So what you hear Oswald say is, "I'm a patsy." Now there's some people who say there was another Oswald or Oswald wasn't there, but if this man they have says he's a patsy, he's involved. If he's innocent, he says he's innocent. Other evidence, of course, puts him there. The rifle, the fingerprints, he was there. He was doing the shooting. So we've got this problem, and that's where Ruby comes in, and Ruby is recruited to kill, and indeed does, kill Oswald in one of the more dramatic television scenes I think we've ever seen. Ruby then becomes the problem, and that's where the letter to Tannehill, Ruby's letter, Ruby's attorney, becomes necessary. Ruby has to be silenced, and he is. The story is complete. The cover-up is done. The Warren Commission issues its report. Everything's over, except for a lot of independent researchers who did their best, looking from the outside in without the power of subpoena or investigation that the Department of Justice has. And they were able to keep it alive and bring together so much of the evidence that we now have. The unique thing I can bring in is insider information as his lawyer. I went with the law firm in 1966 and immediately did work for Johnson. I was rewarded with my own television program, The Law and You, which broadcast just before the NFL Game of the Week, which was a very good spot for television people and for me. I worked with him on other projects too, but mostly I worked very closely with Ed Clark and with Don Thomas. I was Ed Clark's personal attorney when he tries to finish out his fee requirements. We make an application for a bonus well, working with Murchison, and Clark ends up, after 5 years of working on it, with $2 million cold cash after taxes. I can bring these things out because after I left the law firm, I had an ethical dispute with him and left. After I left him, we got into litigation. I was getting nowhere in the courthouse, and so I just put out what I knew. This was in 1984. Put in an affidavit. It was filed in courts in Texas. The DA knew about it. The story, in effect, was out. Couldn't do anything with it at the time, and later, after Clark passes on, I can get things cleared up with the courthouse. Everything's been dismissed there, and take the next step, which is this research of finding the fingerprints. We present it. Well, let me stop. Again, I mentioned something about this dealing with a real world. When we had the fingerprints, and I guess this was the most emotional experience I had in the course of this whole event, this whole book. I knew we had to do one thing, and that's let the Kennedy family know. So we had this package together that was going to be taken to the authorities. Again, it's still an open case. But the first thing I had to do was send a letter to Senator Kennedy and let him at least know that this was coming out. And it's a very emotional thing and I didn't expect an answer. It was a courtesy more than anything. We've since got an indication we may have someone willing to say something on that score. But for right now, I had completed it. We presented it to the Assassination Records Review Board. They were closing their doors at the time. We presented it to the Senate and House, trying to get them to do something. They were reluctant to do anything then. The book was written over the next 5 years. It takes time to write a book, edit it, fact check it and all, and now it's out. The book has more than just a book. Again, we're dealing with the real world. It calls for some reforms that we need in our system of government. Eric mentioned getting the records that are still withheld back out again. And this is important, and we have some interest in getting this done. We're going to keep pushing on it. There are a number of researchers meeting across the country, Dallas, Pittsburgh, 2 in Dallas, 1 in Pittsburgh, and that push is on through them also. We think we can get these records released. My biggest push is to get the legal records released. All the work Clark did for Johnson's was kept in what I call the penthouse files. The firm's records were kept up in the top penthouse of the building we were in, behind lock and key and wall and another lock. And if those could be released, what I'm able to bring to you in the book will be brought out to the public. Johnson, when he dedicated the LBJ library, said he wanted everything out. So what we need to do is enlist the help of the archives, who have control of the LBJ library, to say, this was what Johnson wanted. Give us those records. He's waived the privilege. You'll find out what I'm telling you from those records. Now, that's the book. We've had a lot of things happen in the course of preparing the book. Some people don't want it out. We've had some efforts to censor it. Some people who believe there was a lone nut who fired a silver bullet say, in effect, burned the book. But we've gotten a great deal of good support from a lot of people, and of course moving ahead with it. That pretty well covers the story of the book and brings us down to the present. We are looking for more action. It's been a real experience for me. The thing I found, I guess, most revealing has been to have this book in my hands and realize just how valuable a book really is. Not just this book, but any book. I've always enjoyed books. I did a lot of writing as a lawyer. I did, as the authors tell you, go out and get a lot of experience, and I was able to write it. But a book, for our friends on book notes, is a wonderful thing. And it was, again, an emotional experience having it completed. That's mainly what I have. I guess, as my son says, if anyone has any questions. Oh, let me stop just 1 second. I'm very pleased to have my wife with me today, too. Cecile Williams has joined me, and she's been very helpful with the book. And on questions, I've been asked to ask anyone with a question to please step up to the mic.
Really, you just can't ask the questions. Come back here.
I'm Gary Cozell with the National Press Club. Two questions, two-part question. Number one, I came in a bit late. Was the book the foundation upon which this History Channel broadcast last night was based?
No, it was not. The History Channel was recorded while the book was being written, but it was before the book was completed.
Did you interview LBJ's so-called mistress as she was identified last night on that program?
No, I didn't, but researchers I worked with have talked to her and have interviewed her.
And she's confirmed the essential thrust of your book?
Yes, she has. Now, she passed on, though, in June last year, but she put a book out before she died, Texas in the Morning, and it is available.
One last question. Lots of conspiracy theories out there. You obviously come with a good degree of credibility, but what do you say to people that question your credibility and say this is just, it's wacko, as Nellie Connolly implied the other day when she was at a book fair in Austin?
Well, you did raise another subject there, but first thing is, that's why I put these hard evidence together, these exhibits that you can't really quarrel with. You don't have to believe a word I say, but if you look at those exhibits, and most of them are new, the picture is complete. The best I can do is connect the dots and explain what was going on. Thank you.
You mentioned you sent this to your findings to Senator Kennedy, but then you stopped short about what his response was or what you think it will be. What was his response when you sent this to him, and what have you heard from the Kennedys about this?
Well,
And the second question, I'll just ask the second question and sit down. You have two powerful sons here in Washington, and I'm wondering what they think about it and what their reaction is to it.
Well, let me see if I can do it. First question, second question here. The Kennedys, I knew from their past practice, would not likely say anything, so I really didn't expect a response, but I felt that what we had deserved the courtesy of being brought to their attention. and we did do that. We have an indication from a person claiming to be a member of the family that the description in the book of what happened in Dallas and at Parkland Hospital and on the airplane is accurate. We're still working on that, but my point there is we're dealing with something here in the real world, and we're getting responses. As we say in the book, people have answers and they don't even know the questions, and we're getting that feedback now. And it's proving to be a very interesting life in the real world sort of book. My sons knew that I was working on a book and have known about it for several years, because the book has been in the works for that long. They have not participated in any of the research or any of the writing, and they did know when we made the fingerprint match and the other evidence was presented to the Assassinations Records Review Board. But they didn't participate in any way, shape, or form. Again, it's my responsibility, and I'm putting it out under my signature. They did get the book once it was published. I've mailed it to them, and I will be with them over the weekend, and I'm sure we'll have a little bit to talk about. What I did find is their wives were more interested in the book than they were even. I think they're trying to figure out what their father is like and maybe learn about them. Any other questions?
Is there anything more about Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby that we should know that most people don't know?
I think the big thing on Lee Harvey Oswald was how he had these important connections with Clark. This has not been known before. It mainly came through Big Oil. Sam Ballin was one person who I later represented that could confirm a lot of this. And Sam Ballin was a witness at the Warren Commission. About Ruby, you need to know that his lawyer was named by Clark, was a very close friend, and the exhibit on the wall here shows how Clark could call upon Tannehill to control Ruby and, in fact, keep him muzzled. So this connection into what I call the Texas justice or Bubba justice system exists with both Oswald and Ruby.
Now, as far as the divorce case with Oswald, with his widow, I mean, is that significant as far as the representation there, the attorney?
No, that's not at all. Because you raise an important little point here that I need to mention. The book is not the Warren Commission report. I don't have any 26 extra volumes. I try in here to give you an overview. There's a lot more involved. Some of it's pretty tangential and not really relevant to the heart of the case, but which I tried to bring out. And a lot that's to the heart of the case is assumed to be knowledge on the part of the reader. I'm working on another book to try and bring out some of the points you're just making, how this Texas justice system up close could be as corrupt as it was.
I have two questions.
Thank you.
First of all, what are the documents that you would like to see released, and what makes you think that those documents exist, and who would be releasing them? And second of all, what experience have you had? You mentioned that there's been some media censorship, and I know that you were booked and announced for Good Morning America and canceled at the last minute, and subsequently ABC announced that they had created an animated special with the magic bullet. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on the obstacles you've encountered with getting press coverage on your book.
Well, so the obstacles have been from many directions, really. We've been successful in getting programs booked, and then once we announce them, we find them canceled. Eric mentioned the Good Morning America setting. That setting was announced, confirmed, posted on their webpage, and ready to go when they got word, apparently from above, to cancel it. Censorship is what we're dealing with here, I'm afraid, and we need to get around that. I've also heard it from some writers in the field. Gerald Posner says, don't buy the book, in effect saying burn it, but I don't know what he's afraid of. And I don't know what censorship has to do with getting this book out and bringing out these facts that are not available in any other way. which gets to the first part of your question. There are a lot of documents apparently still out there. The Assassination Records Review Board was successful in getting a good bit out, but the President's Foreign Policy Intelligence Board didn't turn its reports over. The Department of Justice and FBI held back records, and the CIA still hasn't answered some other key questions. Those we know of for sure. And the Warren Commission itself had about, I think it's 300 cubic feet of documents that it suppressed when it issued its report. Now, those supposedly have been released, but they've been redacted, which means the key information has been crossed out, and you really don't have anything there either. So the government itself has a vast amount, well, I better not say vast, because there is so much vast documents already, but there is a lot out there still that we need. And the strange thing is the government sitting over on the Hill has ordered the government sitting down Pennsylvania Avenue here to turn these documents over, and the government itself cannot get the government to release these documents. So we're calling on the government to do something. And again, we're not the only ones. A number of other people are. There's a lot out there, and we really need to bring it in. And again, I'll fall back on the lawyers' records. If we get those, you get the picture. Any other questions?
What was the driving force for you to write this book?
I think when it was all said and done, I had an agent who told me it would be a great story. But it is a good story, and I do want to tell it. And I've lived it. I think it's very important. And I try and bring this out in the book where what I'm really trying to do here is more is involved here than may appear on its face. The idea that a vice president would kill a president is foreign to the thinking of many Americans. In New York, I get asked the question, how could a vice president think that way? And I tell him, well, John, here's what happened. New York had a vice president in 1800 named Aaron Burr. And he killed, and he tried to take over the country and set up his own country, tried to do it. Aaron Burr grew out of this Revolutionary War where killing was okay, violence was an accepted way of life, dueling was okay. Flip forward about 150 years and you have a man of that same mentality that violence is okay, and you see it in Lyndon Johnson, you see it in Edward Clark. So they're willing to go ahead with it. And these things are important to approach, I think. I really ended up, as I was finishing the book, trying to understand it myself and come to some kind of an understanding that made sense. And I found one thing, fact and fiction books have a lot in common. Good fiction is good fact, and good fact makes good fiction. What we're really dealing with here, though, is power and how it corrupts. And some of the great novels and plays in history have addressed this question. And the one that came to my mind, I put it in the book here, is Hamlet, where he knows what has happened. His father, the king, had been killed, and his uncle had taken over. And he knew he had to do something for that. And the question he posed to himself was, to be or not to be? And people have wondered what he was really meaning. And I think when you see the end of the play, you see what he was talking about, because the kingdom was over, he was dead, and it was really an awesome step that he was trying to consider, and it did cause him pause. I think we have this same thing now here, and we just have got to face up to what happened, base it on these facts, more facts like I've been able to put on the wall here, and get an answer. Yes?
A lot of the men, were that we know from this time period. I mean, they all really aspired to power. I mean, I've heard accusations that Richard Nixon knew much more than, what has generally been known. And John Connally, obviously was seriously contending for president, and Bobby Kennedy did that. Are there connections there that, as far as with the aspirations of these men, as far as are they guilty in any way that that hasn't been that they haven't been accused of?
Not that I know of, but I say the investigation's going on. We, through the researchers I've worked with, are continuing this interest. and we're still looking. We'd like to get all we could. So much of it is sealed away that we can't touch it. But I don't know of anything specific from the individuals you mentioned. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Actually, maybe the most known theory about the assassination of John Kennedy is the theory disposed by Oliver Stone in his famous movie. So what the difference, because it's about a conspiracy about the CIA, the mafia, the Cubans. So what is the difference with your book besides, the responsibility of Lyndon Johnson?
Well, let me explain, because you see there's not that big a difference. Oliver Stone did come out with a movie that was critical to keeping the investigation going, to set up the Assassination Records Review Board. He never named any one group. As you mentioned, there were several, but he did not exclude Lyndon Johnson. What I'm bringing in is how Lyndon Johnson had this interest, and when I mentioned earlier, Edward Clark made sure he had support. He talked to, and we've been able to track it both to Dallas and to Houston, to make sure that he had the support of Big Oil. And through Big Oil, because a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of their money went into the military-industrial complex, and through Brown and Root. So you had these major economic interests that were aware that something was going to happen. But Clark kept the assassination very, very close. In other words, very few people that were involved and really knew about it. What he did was what he's done for years and years, and that's give what's called insider information. And the more vague he made it, the bigger it was. His friends knew that. And he couldn't tell them some things because they had to have what's called credible deniability. In other words, if crimes were charged, he couldn't tell them, well, I recommended you buy some of Texas Eastern natural gas pipeline because it's going to go really going to go up. But these things were going on. It was insider's approach, and Clark was so trusted by these men. And what they were really feeding on is not so much the specifics like the Vietnam War, but a general unhappiness with the way Kennedy was trying to build peace and work some sort of a living relationship with the Soviet Union. They did not want this to happen. I mentioned Edwin Walker earlier. He was one person that went over the wall, so to speak, overboard on it. There were others, and there was this deep-seated feeling that a lot of people had, and they were very powerful people. They didn't want John Kennedy around. They did not like the way he was taking the country.
But Lyndon Johnson was a part of the chain, or he's the main responsibility in John Kennedy assassination?
The best explanation I can give it is that there was this bonfire ready to go off, and Johnson became the spark because of the deep problems he was facing, both in not having any power and being threatened with imprisonment. And when he could talk to Clark and get Clark to go to work to make sure that what would be done would be okay, without giving out any details, it happened. I try and bring that out in the book too, this almost subtle world that exists among these men with great power, where they don't say, here's what we're doing, blah, 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 and lay it out 1, 2, 3, but they know, something's going to happen, and it does. Yes?
Just wondering, is there anything in your book about the fact that Earl Warren did not take Jack Ruby to Washington to testify? Otherwise, would it be your opinion that Warren was told not to have Ruby come to Washington? Or I don't know if you can shed any light on that in your book.
I mentioned that very briefly, but the only thing Earl Warren was, and I think a respected jurist, but why he didn't do more is beyond me. Part of it was the other members of the commission were pretty much set in one way, and he probably couldn't have made any change there. He went to see the Ruby polygraph exam, and Ruby failed it. And yet, Earl Warren did nothing to follow up with what you were just talking about. I don't go into that very deeply, but I do mention that most members of the Warren Commission over the years agreed they had not done a good job and wished they'd done a much better job. And Earl Warren, I think it was his words himself, that it was the biggest disappointment in my career. Yes?
Why were the oil men opposed to Kennedy?
They opposed him deeply because really three things: the depletion allowance, imports, and federal regulation of natural gas prices. I guess that's where I specifically came in as an expert. But this was a fight that Johnson picked up in 1949 when he came into the Senate and became the oil business's lobbyist on the floor of the Senate. The Senate knew that if they wanted to do anything with depletion allowance, imports, or natural gas, they had to go through Johnson, and it was a bitter fight. Johnson was the one, though, by keeping them from having any of these changes made that were trying to be made that turned the oil multimillionaires into billionaires in the 60s.
I'm trying to understand, you worked as a lawyer in Texas. And I guess you were representing these same interests, these oil interests.
Indeed, I was. This is what I alluded to a little bit earlier. I represented Aztec Oil, which had a really big case going, and we managed to lift the lid on natural gas prices. The value of the company went from $8 a share in 2 months to something like $160 a share. It was that kind of a change. Shortly after that, the Federal Power Commission pretty well pulled back from regulation, set a national rate, and then it disappeared. But Aztec Oil was owned by Wofford Kane, who was a founding member of Big Oil, grew up in Athens, Texas with Clint Murkison. They were dear friends, and through him and his officers, I learned a lot about these connections that existed.
So you moved from working for Big Oil to trying to expose this.
Well, it became a necessity, yes. I had a falling out with my partners. They wanted me to represent a company, Lovaca, that was stealing left and right, where I'd been representing most of the other companies in Texas against them. They asked me 3 different times in the course of about an hour to sign this document, and I refused, saying we had a conflict and I wasn't about to. And that's when they took it to Clark, and he sent the word back to me that this is something Leon Jaworski wants, and whatever he wants, he gets. And I still didn't sign, and I left the firm shortly after that. So I was, that would have been about 1976. I have to equivocate a little because when I left the law firm, I left everything. I thought it was protected by the privilege, and I couldn't touch this information. When they sued me, though, and I got into a fight with one of their banks, I said, forget it. This is a corrupt system. I don't have to put up with this anymore. I then looked into the privilege itself. Now, the privilege is very broad. It says that an attorney can't tell what happens unless necessary to prevent imminent injury. I think that's wrong. I think there is no protection for lawyers to commit crimes, and I don't have any trouble bringing it out.
Okay, so one final thing. Well, now your sons are working for an administration that's beholden to Big Oil. How do you feel about that?
I have no information about what's going on now. If I were the lawyer for the president, I might know more.
Read the newspapers. You know that's in fact the case.
Well, I really don't, because I don't have the comfort of being there and knowing what's really being said by the lawyers. And I don't know any way I'd ever found out. But as a lawyer, Edward Clark was what was called by a Washington writer super lawyer. And these guys know what's going on, and they're the ones I think you'd have to ask that question. I can't tell you what's going on now. Most of these men that were really ruthless have disappeared from the scene, and I guess the safest comment is the one my son makes. I just can't make a comment on it.
You seem to be more assertive than any writer I've read about Johnson, that you're claiming that he was never a religious man, and you said that he would have a refrain, if I can't touch it, it ain't real. And then you're claiming that he really at times believed he was God himself, but you said in his last days he did get some religion, and then that was part of the torment that he was in personally?
Yes. Excuse me, yeah, but that's right. When he left the presidency, he was a broken man in deep depression brought on by his paranoia. Lady Bird, that's when he and Lady Bird really became close. And she tried to help him, and a private psychiatrist was brought in and did, in effect, help him get rid of his demons and prepare him to meet his maker. So he did get religion then. But when he referred to himself as, hell, boys, don't you know I am God? He was not taking any supreme being with any respect except himself.
Any information on Eugene Hill braiding or Jim Braden? Well,
I've seen it. I don't have enough to say what he was doing. Some people think, and still believe that, but I don't have any information on him. Any other questions? Thank you very much.